What's up, homies? Do you guys read? I read. I don't read often. Well, that's not true. I read a lot of shit posts, is what I do. That's what I like. That's my milieu. You know what I'm saying? Regardless, I've been reading. At the behest of a good homie of mine, Shaggy, you know him from the podcast, he called me kind of serendipitously out of the blue and was telling me about an insane Toyota commercial. And the Toyota commercial is pretty tame as far as like commercials go, you know. Big truck, rocks, sand, land, deer, stare. You know what I'm talking about? That kind of thing, right? But the tagline in it was what was particularly insane. The tagline being, "Devour the Untamed." Something about that tagline kind of like tripped something up. It triggered something in me. And it reminded me of my favorite book of all time, the second novel by Will Self, My Idea of Fun. Now, the reason why that tagline reminded me of this insane book is because the character, like one of the main characters, I would kind of say not antagonist, but also not protagonist, kind of like this mysterious third tagonist, if you would. He has kind of a bombastic way of speaking, and it almost sounds as if he would say, "Ian, my boy, devour the untamed. Let the wriggles of capitalism define your very excrement." I don't know. So he would say something to that extent. I realize that this is a book that not a lot of people have read, and it's kind of frustrating because, like a lot of my favorite things, it's stuff that not a lot of people have either been exposed to or have never had the context to be exposed to this stuff. So this is kind of like my opportunity to talk about some stuff that I just enjoy thoroughly and think other homies would as well too. My belief is that a good critic or a good critique isn't discouraging you from reading something or discouraging you or telling you that you shouldn't experience something or telling you that you will like something, but instead just more or less trying to put you on to something you normally wouldn't enjoy. So that kind of leads us to where we are now with this insane book. The book itself kind of, well, it's there's a word for Bildungsroman or Bildungsroman, I think is like the literary term. It has something to do with like they would write books. It's like a German word, and the book is about a protagonist where his original belief system and how he thought of stuff is entirely different from when he is an adult. So the book starts off that way. It's in the first person in the very beginning, and it's from the perspective of a young boy growing up in what can only really be described as like beach town outside of London. And it's kind of like, I don't know how familiar you are. In my mind, it registers as a Californian. It registers as kind of like a Santa Cruz type place, mostly because anyone who is aware, Santa Cruz has this incredible like, yeah, you should come and visit during the summer when it's on. It's beautiful out there. And if you go there any other time, it's like, holy shit, this place is on fire. How does anyone live here? And it's kind of a similar experience, this kind of like slowness, this kind of like ennui that's just general in the whole beginning of the book during the off season. But this boy, Ian Wharton, is the main character. He has something that makes him a little bit different than all the other people around him, and that is his ability to have eidetic memory. So for those who don't know what eidetic or eidesis is, eidetic memory is the ability to picture something perfectly in your mind, like a completely solid picture that you can recall at any given time. It's a lot of people who have like usually some kind of like non-neurotypical disorders, like they're not neurotypical. Like I'm thinking like people on the autism spectrum, people with Asperger's, they have eidetic memory and like spatial, like their ability to like take a picture with their mind and then perfect recall, draw everything from their mind. He has that, but he's not on this spectrum in any way. And at first, it's kind of like just a little party trick that he shows to his friends and psychologists, but eventually they realize that it's really not helping him in any way, so he just is kind of not given any more attention until he meets someone called the Fat Controller, a guy who goes by many names in the book, Samuel Northcliffe or Mr. Broadhurst. Mr. Broadhurst brings Ian into this world of like occultism through his Odysseus. And I'm actually very interested in the character of the Fat Controller, mostly just because what I find very fascinating about him is his ability to kind of be both believable as a character in the sense that he could just be like an eccentric old man, or he could really be this type of grandiose villain, almost Mephistopheles type character. Definitely demonic, but Ian is an unreliable narrator as you continue through the book. Ian kind of has this mopey quality about him in the first, I want to say, almost 3/4 of the book. Ian's kind of a poor me. Why did I get exposed to this great and grand occultism? This, like, this thing that kind of puts him in heads and shoulders above the people around him. It's kind of revealed that it's almost as if there's a long-term conspiracy. He's the beneficiary of like a long-term conspiracy to kind of mold him into the perfect protege for someone like Mr. Broadhurst. But the book itself is you're going through his kind of first half, this like general just mopey sadness about why he kind of can't enjoy a regular life because of this Mr. Broadhurst character and his mom. And there's a lot of like neurotic quality that is very, I guess, like palpable. And that's what I really like about Will Self, right? Will Self as a writer, I feel like doesn't really get as many flowers. At least, like, I don't know that many people that read Will Self, and I would like to change that. But Will Self definitely has like a kind of a style that will shed you instantly if you're not someone that enjoys verbosity. If you don't enjoy someone who's just extremely verbose, using big words just to use big words, being kind of flippant about his plot. A lot of his plots kind of don't matter. It's more or less he's giving you this kind of like prosaic candy, a lot of just big fluff. And he kind of front loads a lot of his work that way. And if you can't really like stomach that, and you find yourself getting bored with it, it'll pretty much kind of lock you out from really interacting with the subtext of what's going on with his characters and his books. Because My Idea of Fun, which is his second novel, is one of, I think, his best works because it kind of indulges in a way and makes this, it sets up like a foundational world, right? Like the rules of magic for the rest of his world. And in reality, it's kind of like a very interesting critique of kind of like the occultism, the everyday banal occultism of capitalism, especially because as Ian grows up and matures, he finds himself gravitating towards business, being a business major. And as he later finds out, Mr. Broadhurst has a second life as a huge, massive stockbroker is the wrong. He's a business magnate. He's one of those people that does business for the sake of business. And you'll kind of see as he continues to progress in the story, the Samuel Northcliffe character, who's also Mr. Broadhurst, who's also the Fat Controller, you'll kind of see that as devilish and as satanic and kind of like omnipresent as he is, even he is subject to the, I guess, like overall failure of products and, capitalism. So even he loses money, even he fucks up sometimes. And in the story, the Fat Controller goes in and out of Ian Wharton's life, right? He's got this kind of revolving door relationship where he'll spend whole summers or whole winters away and then just kind of come in the slow season to teach Ian basic magic. And or not even basic magic, it's like magic with the K, the occult magic. And one of the more interesting things that I thought that was really cool about Ian Wharton's journey into magic is his sanity rituals which were him writing down the exact amount of bodily functions he would do a day, and then kind of ritualize writing that down. So like if he like would take a piss, how many times would he take a piss? If he took a dump, like what was the exact time and frame? I mean, everything you can imaginably do, like, you know, beating it, all that stuff. He wrote it all down in a journal, in this like ledger, and he would just kind of keep it to himself at the uh, advice of Mr. Broadhurst, or the Fat Controller, telling him to do that, so that he would continue, I guess, like he would ritualize and understand and poke and prod the very levels of his sanity, the things that we all kind of do and take for granted and we don't think of. He would spend most of his time thinking about that in like very direct ways. You find as the story continues to evolve, Mr. Broadhurst changes his appearance multiple times, and not in a way that's like noticeable by most people. What happens is he goes through these motions of being both looking younger and looking more strong, despite being, as he's described, extremely fat and dense, kind of like your boy here. Um, he goes through these periods of being extremely like youthful almost, and then also simultaneously appearing very old and frail. It's kind of Ian kind of it lets you know that Ian is an unreliable narrator, because he kind of mixes up sometimes how he's describing him, and that's an interesting quality about him, because it doesn't really make you feel like he's an unreliable narrator in as much as it makes you feel that the Fat Controller exists in two forms that are almost contradictory. As Ian Wharton continues to grow up, and that mopiness kind of sheds and falls away as he continues to get his business education and gravitates towards marketing, where the Fat Controller, after years of not talking to or making himself known to Ian, Ian kind of begins to feel that maybe he had hallucinated, or maybe he had just had some kind of psychotic break as a child where he imagined all of his adventures with Mr. Broadhurst or the Fat Controller. So then steps in a psychiatrist known as Hieronymus Geigel. I think it's spelled giggle with a Y, so Gyggle, but I think it's pronounced Geigel, but I could be wrong. Will Self has a tendency to make jokes, like write jokes in his books that are like extremely obvious while also like being completely stupid, which I like. I like that about his writing. Anyways, he wrote Hieronymus Geigel gets into the story, gets involved in the story as Ian's psychiatrist, and he takes a special interest in Ian, especially with the eidetic memory being a thing now. So he finds himself being taken under the wing and tutelage of Dr. Geigel from his late, I want to say his late college years all the way up until like his now professional years. Meanwhile, Dr. Geigel kind of begins opening up. He opens up his own, like, he doesn't open it up. He takes a job at a mental hospital. I think it's a mental hospital that specializes in people who are on drugs, mainly heroin addicts. And Dr. Geigel kind of seems at first like someone who is just more or less interested in disproving the idea of someone like the Fat Controller existing to Ian, while also maintaining a kind of similar, or not like similar is not the right word, but almost like a parallel existence with the Fat Controller, but with the people, the heroin addicts that he has in his hospital, the people under his care. You don't really get too far into that kind of story, but it's then later revealed that the Fat Controller exists, and Ian sees Samuel Northcliffe, and the Fat Controller returns. And when he returns, he shows Ian a little, I guess, magic trick that the Fat Controller has kind of used, called retroscendence, which is the ability to touch something like a piece of clothing or any kind of like material product and retroscend all the way backwards into the creation of the product down to the very when it was like first just fiber growing on a cotton plant, and being able to watch the entire journey of the process of that cotton turning into the shirt. And it's kind of like showing it's weird. It's a weird like detour in the book altogether because it doesn't. I don't see how it could really help Ian his marketing career, but it does kind of show you that like the Fat Controller's occultism and magic is deeply tied to transactions. It's he more or less is plugged into, and that's really what I really really like about Will Self's work is this kind of like larger story about almost the occult practices that are ever present in money, the kind of like double speak that people use to talk about currencies and markets and changing value. And I find all that extremely fascinating because Will Self has such a good way of making that like such a poignant metaphor while also like maintaining of like a real sense of mystery to it, where like you don't, it's not beating you over the head. It's kind of letting you know, hey, a lot of the insider talk that these guys talk, it's mumbo jumbo, right? It's not. It's occult practices. It's them. It's luck. It's rituals. It's not anything that they've really thought or decided. It's not anything that they can calculate in a meaningful way. And I think that to me that's more my focus of the story itself, because the story ultimately veers into like what a lot of people would see as just kind of like shock to be shock, like shock value, shock jock, pulpish kind of just ugliness, especially when the story gets into Ian traveling to the land of children's jokes, which is full of deformed characters that are all represent like the horrible jokes that we all told as kids, the like dead baby jokes, the jokes about it's hard to explain. There's a lot of horrible shit in there. But as Ian kind of is acquainted with the land of children's jokes and then reacquainted with the Fat Controller, he understands his place with the Fat Controller in a way. And kind of that mopiness that I was talking about in the first half of the book is gone. There's much more of a confident, almost, well, not almost, actually, literally evil. He's changed his ways for the worst. He's aware of the evil that he commits for the Fat Controller. He's aware of the evil that is being an acolyte of the Fat Controller. And as he like continues to develop, as the book continues to push on, it goes further and further, and you kind of see Ian surpass the Fat Controller and be better than the Fat Controller, but in a way where it's kind of controlled, where it was all at the Fat Controller's like machinations and mechanisms. And like the book itself is I find myself really enjoying that book, and I've read it like maybe 7 or 8 times at this point. But every time I read it, I find myself pulling something different from it. I think the last time I read it, which was, I want to say like 2 or 3 weeks ago, maybe even a week ago, I found myself really gravitating towards the idea of banal magic, this banality of like of ritual that we just kind of all are part of, right? Like socially, society. There's a lot of like subtext in that book that I'm not really covering because I could be here for hours trying to cover it. But there's a lot of subtext in that book about social climbing, about Ian's mother, who was what they called like a caravaner, who's like essentially like it's the English version of trailer trash in America. She like socially climbed her way out of that and into like owning a very illustrious hotel that was a destination for lots of people to come by, and she had so completely fallen away from how she was, like where the trappings of her beginning, her origin, and is now completely alien, even to the family that she grew up with, and all of that kind of seems like it's kind of alluded to that the Fat Controller helped her do that by her promising her firstborn, which is Ian, to the Fat Controller. And then Ian himself goes from being someone who is kind of meek and mopey and not very friendly, not someone who has a lot of friends, and they transform him at the end into this kind of business savvy marketing whiz who is just, happily married and has that storybook life. But it comes at like a very, I don't want to spoil the ending, but it comes at a very insane cost. And Ian is, for the most part, completely evil and insane. Um, as the book progresses, you kind of get this sense that there is this deep conspiracy. Conspiracy is the wrong word. There's an interesting occultism in Will Self's work that isn't just present in here. He's written a bunch of like short stories and stuff. I think one of the my favorite ones that he's written um, is the quantitative theory of insanity, which revisits Dr. Geigel, but doesn't really get into like the fat controller stuff. But it kind of explains that there's like he has this theory that uh, there's psychosis, that there's a limited quantity of sanity, of like being sane in the world, and it just has to fall on someone's shoulders to be insane, to kind of like it's kind of like it's what is the word I'm thinking of? It's ephemeral, right? It's not something you can hold on to. It's something that just kind of phases in and out. Some people have sanity, some people don't have sanity, and what I really enjoy about that is this kind of capitalist idea of like it's not capitalist is the wrong word, but like a market force for sanity. And these two books kind of talk about Will Self's, I guess, like idea about there being this deep dark psychological undercurrent in the world, well, like I guess in the Western world, that is extremely socially uh, it's socially adversarial, right? Where if you're not one of us, then you have to like kill something in yourself or change everything about yourself to become something of a respected member of society. And then to see the respected members of society, to see them being revered, this like double life of being able to see them be revered in their social aspects, but they're complete degenerates behind doors, is very indicative of Will Self's. I think I don't want to go too far because I have read his biography and he does talk about his kind of experiences with that, but I think he does paint a very good picture of this kind of secret society of degenerate scumbags who control everything. And I find myself really enjoying these stories that take place in this world, mostly just because of the parallels that we kind of get daily on our own of our own world that kind of is like that. Um, I want to say when he wrote this book in 1993, and he was writing pretty prolifically in the 90s and early 2000s. I feel like at the time he was writing about a parallel universe. As we continue finding out about the lifestyles of the rich and famous, uh, that is no longer the case. I don't think he's writing about a parallel universe. He's writing about an exaggerated universe for sure, but I fail to find it very. It's almost perverse how close a lot of the insanity and the motivations that uh, Will Self writes in his villains kind of continue popping up in just popular culture. This was a long and rambling, like, book report, I guess, or book review. I don't really see a lot of content about Will Self. I see less content about this book in particular. I would love to see more content. If you've read this book, if you haven't read this book, uh, give me a comment. Let's talk about this. I want to comment below. I want more people to read this book. I think there's a lot of stuff going on in this book that I couldn't have possibly covered, but I think a dialogue is good, and I think Honestly, it's one of my favorite books. It's one of the books that really got me into like reading for pleasure, uh, because I'm a little bit of a fucking, what are those called? Like an edgelord, and this is very much in the edgelord realm of books, but it's kind of a little bit of an obscure one. I definitely think that it's worth your time and worth your while, and you should read it. Later, homies.